Rain had a way of making the city look quieter than it really was. By 12:30 in the morning, most of the restaurants along Harbour Avenue had already turned off their neon signs. The laughter that had filled the streets only an hour earlier had dissolved into the steady rhythm of rain tapping against empty sidewalks. Claire Dawson stepped out of the diner carrying a worn canvas backpack and a folded umbrella that refused to stay open. Her shift had lasted nearly 14 hours. Every muscle in her body protested as she locked the employee's entrance behind her. She checked the tips inside her apron pocket. $46, not enough to fix the heater in her apartment. Not enough to replace the shoes whose soles had begun separating weeks ago, but enough for groceries tomorrow. She smiled anyway. One day at a time, she whispered to herself. The rain answered with another soft patter against the pavement. Claire chose the shortcut home through an older neighborhood where brick buildings leaned close together and antique street lamps painted warm circles of gold across the wet road. The city felt strangely empty. No passing cars, no voices, only rain. She had almost reached the end of the block when something small floated across the sidewalk and bumped gently against her shoe. Claire stopped. A toy. It was carved from smooth wood, about the size of both her hands together. It resembled a tiny fox wearing a little blue scarf. The paint had faded around its ears and one button eye had clearly been sewn back more than once. Someone had loved this toy for a very long time. She crouched and picked it up carefully. The wood was unexpectedly warm despite the cold rain. Claire brushed a few droplets away with her sleeve. "You shouldn't be lying out here alone," she murmured. A sudden sound echoed from somewhere beyond the alley. Small footsteps, running fast. Then a frightened voice. "Please." It was almost too quiet to hear beneath the rain. Claire turned. At the opposite end of the narrow alley stood a little boy. He looked no older than 7. His black coat was soaked from the storm, hanging heavily around his small shoulders. Dark hair clung to his forehead, and his pale face looked almost luminous beneath the street lamp. But it wasn't his appearance that caught Claire's attention. It was his eyes. They weren't crying. They were searching. Desperately. His gaze darted across puddles, trash bins, and rain-darkened bricks until it landed on the toy in Claire's hands. His entire body froze. "You found him," the boy whispered. Relief flooded his face so suddenly that Claire felt her own shoulders relax. "Is this yours?" The boy nodded without moving. Claire walked toward him slowly, careful not to frighten him. I think he was trying to run away. She offered the little wooden fox with both hands. The child accepted it with surprising care, almost like someone receiving something fragile enough to break if held too tightly. His fingers trembled. For several seconds he simply stared at the toy. Then he hugged it against his chest. Claire noticed tiny scratches covering the wooden scarf. Years of tiny hands, years of adventures, years of being carried everywhere. "You must have been worried," she said softly. The boy looked up. He hesitated. "I thought I'd lost him forever." Claire's heart tightened. "My grandmother always said that toys remember the people who love them. Maybe that's why he found his way back." The child blinked. For the first time, a small smile appeared. It was quiet, almost shy. "Thank you." Those 2 words carried far more weight than a child his age should have known. Claire stood. "You should get home before your parents worry." The boy glanced over her shoulder instead of answering. His expression changed. Not fear, recognition. Claire instinctively turned around. Nothing, only rain drifting beneath the streetlights. When she looked back, the boy was gone, completely. No footsteps, no closing door, no running figure disappearing around the corner. Only empty pavement glistening beneath the rain. Claire frowned. That was fast. She laughed softly at herself. Guess he really wanted to get home. She adjusted her backpack and continued walking toward the apartment, never noticing the movement high above the rooftops. Black vehicles entered the neighborhood one after another without sirens. Their headlights remained dim. Men dressed in long dark coats stepped onto the sidewalks with impossible precision. None of them spoke loudly. They didn't need to. Every movement carried quiet discipline. One of them knelt beside the exact spot where Claire had picked up the toy. He touched the wet pavement, then looked toward the direction she had walked. "We're too late," he said. Another figure approached from the darkness. "Did someone find the young prince?" The first man answered without taking his eyes off the rain-soaked street. "Yes." A pause, and according to the security report. He slowly turned toward the empty avenue where Claire had already disappeared into the night. A human waitress returned it. Silence settled over the alley. Even the rain seemed to soften. Finally, the older man gave one quiet order. "Find her, far away." Unaware that an entire hidden kingdom had just learned of her existence, Claire Dawson unlocked the door to her tiny apartment and believed this had been nothing more than a strange encounter on a rainy night. She had no idea that returning one forgotten toy had already changed the course of 3 lives. The rain had not stopped by the time Claire Dawson reached her apartment, but sleep refused to come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the little boy hugging the wooden fox as though it were the only thing keeping him together. There had been something unusual about him. It was not simply his unnaturally pale skin or the elegant black coat that looked far too expensive for a child wandering alone after midnight. It was the quiet sadness in his eyes, the kind that no 7-year-old should ever carry. Claire finally drifted into a restless sleep just before dawn. When morning arrived, the city looked ordinary again. Commuters hurried towards subway stations. Delivery trucks clogged narrow streets. Harbour Avenue buzzed with the familiar sounds of another workday. Claire convinced herself the strange encounter had simply been one of those unforgettable moments that sometimes happened in large cities. By noon, she was back inside the diner, tying her apron and greeting customers with the same warm smile she wore every day. "Morning, Claire," called her manager Frank. "Busy lunch ahead." "I'm ready," she answered, grabbing a coffee pot before weaving between crowded tables. Hours passed quickly, refilling cups, delivering burgers, wiping counters. Listening to conversations she would never remember. Everything felt normal again until the front door opened. 3 men entered together. Every conversation inside the diner seemed to soften, though no one could explain why. They were dressed in perfectly tailored black coats despite the warmer afternoon. Their polished shoes carried no trace of dirt. Each of them moved with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to absolute discipline. Claire noticed something else. None of them looked around in curiosity. They walked directly toward a corner booth as though they already knew the building by heart. "Table 12, Frank whispered. "Take good care of them." Claire picked up 3 menus and approached with her usual smile. "Welcome. Can I start you with something to drink?" The eldest of the 3 men looked at her for several seconds before answering. His silver-grey eyes were strangely intense, making Claire feel as though he were comparing her face to a memory. "Coffee," he replied calmly. "Black." The other 2 ordered the same. Claire nodded politely and headed back toward the counter. As she filled the mugs, she could feel their eyes following her every movement. Not rude, not threatening, simply studying her. She carried the coffees back to their table. Before she could step away, the oldest man spoke again. "You walked home late last night?" Claire paused. "Yes, near Ashford Alley." She blinked. "How did you know that?" The man ignored the question. "Did you happen to see anything unusual?" Claire hesitated. She remembered the frightened child and the wooden fox tucked safely against his chest. Something inside her told her not to mention him immediately. "Just the rain," she answered gently. The man's expression remained unreadable. "Nothing else?" Claire slowly shook her head. "No." A long silence followed. Finally, he gave the smallest nod. "Thank you for your honesty." It was an odd choice of words. Honesty. As though he already knew she had left something unsaid. Claire returned to serving other customers, but she caught pieces of their conversation whenever she passed nearby. "The perimeter has been expanded. No witnesses," reported the crest. "His Highness has been safely returned." The words meant nothing to her, yet each sentence carried the weight of something far larger than ordinary business. 20 minutes later, the 3 men stood to leave. The eldest placed enough cash on the table to cover the bill several times over. Claire hurried after him with the extra money. "Sir, you left too much." He looked down at the folded bills in her hand. "Keep it." Claire immediately shook her head. "I can't." "Why not?" "Because it isn't mine." For the first time, the man's expression softened almost imperceptibly. He accepted the money back without another word. Then he reached inside his coat and removed a simple white business card. There was no company logo, no address. Only a phone number embossed in silver. "If the child ever returns, call immediately." Claire frowned. "Who is he?" The man met her eyes for one quiet moment. "Someone very important to people who love him." Before she could ask another question, the 3 men walked out of the diner and disappeared into the afternoon crowd with the same impossible precision they had arrived with. Claire stood beside the window, still holding the mysterious card. Across the street, parked beneath the shade of an old oak tree, a long black luxury sedan waited silently. Behind the tinted rear window sat a lone figure. Claire could not see his face clearly, only the outline of broad shoulders and the faint reflection of pale eyes watching the diner from a distance. The vehicle remained there for only a few seconds before pulling smoothly into traffic and vanishing without a sound. Hundreds of feet away, Inside the moving car, Damien Rousseau lowered the photograph resting on his lap. It showed Claire kneeling in the rain, offering the little wooden fox back to his son with both hands. He said nothing. He simply looked out the window as the city slipped past, while the driver quietly understood that for the first time in many years, the Vampire King had become interested in a human. Claire Dawson tried to forget the mysterious business card, but it stayed in the front pocket of her apron for the rest of the day. Every few hours, her fingers brushed against its smooth surface as if making sure it was still there. She had considered throwing it away more than once. After all, it belonged to 3 strangers who somehow knew where she had walked the previous night. Yet something stopped her every time. Their questions had never sounded threatening. They had sounded protective. That single difference lingered in her mind long after her shift ended. 2 evenings later, the diner was quieter than usual. Rain clouds had finally disappeared, replaced by a cool autumn breeze drifting through the city. The dinner rush faded earlier than expected, leaving only a handful of customers scattered across the room. Frank leaned against the counter with a tired smile. "Looks like we're getting out early tonight." Claire nodded as she stacked clean coffee mugs. "That'll be nice for a change." Just as she finished wiping the counter, the bell above the entrance chimed softly. Claire looked up automatically. Her heart skipped for the briefest moment. Standing hesitantly inside the doorway was the same little boy she had met in the alley. Tonight he wore a charcoal grey sweater beneath his black coat, and the little wooden fox was tucked safely beneath one arm. His pale face looked healthier than before, but he still scanned the room carefully before noticing Claire. The moment their eyes met, his shoulders relaxed. Claire smiled warmly. "Well, hello again." The boy returned a shy smile before walking toward her. "Looks like you did." She knelt until they were nearly eye level. "Are you here by yourself?" The boy nodded once. "Only for a little while." Claire instinctively glanced toward the windows. No worried parents, no family waiting outside. "Would you like something to eat?" she asked gently. "I don't know if I should." Claire smiled. "Then let me make the decision. Sit wherever you'd like." He chose the same corner booth where the 3 mysterious men had sat 2 days earlier. Claire brought him a cup of warm milk and a small slice of homemade apple pie that the kitchen would have thrown away at closing time. "It's on the house," she whispered. The little boy stared at the dessert with genuine curiosity. "I've never had this before." Claire laughed softly. He nodded. "Father says sweet things are unnecessary." She raised an eyebrow with amusement. "Well, I respectfully disagree with your father." The child carefully picked up a fork and tasted the smallest bite. His eyes widened almost instantly. Claire couldn't help laughing again. "Good?" He nodded enthusiastically. "Very good." For several peaceful minutes, the diner seemed wonderfully ordinary. A lonely waitress, a quiet little boy. Warm lights reflecting against polished tables. Outside, traffic rolled by beneath the golden glow of streetlights. Claire watched him hug the wooden fox between bites of pie. "You really love that little guy, don't you?" The child looked down at the toy and gently traced one of its worn wooden ears. "Mother made him." His voice became almost a whisper before she went away. Claire's smile faded. She didn't ask where his mother had gone. Some questions were better left untouched. Instead, she simply said, "Then I'm very glad you found him again." The child looked at her for a long moment before speaking quietly. "Father smiled when he saw him." Claire blinked. "He did?" "He doesn't smile very much anymore." Something inside her heart tightened again. She knew adults like that, people carrying losses too heavy to explain. Before she could respond, the little boy suddenly looked toward the front window. His expression changed instantly. Not fear, recognition. "They're here." Claire turned toward the entrance just as 2 black luxury vehicles stopped silently outside the diner. The engines were almost impossible to hear. Their doors opened in perfect unison. Several men in long black coats stepped onto the sidewalk, their movements calm and impossibly precise. The child sighed quietly. "They found me." Claire looked back at him. "Were they looking for you?" He nodded. "They always do." One of the men approached the entrance but stopped before opening the door. Instead, he respectfully lowered his head toward someone still seated inside the rear vehicle. He seemed to be waiting for permission. Claire followed his gaze. Through the dark-tinted glass, she could barely make out the silhouette of a tall man sitting motionless in the back seat. Although his features remained hidden, she felt an inexplicable weight in the air the moment she looked toward him. It was not fear, it was presence. The little boy carefully climbed down from the booth and hugged the wooden fox against his chest. Before walking away, he turned back toward Claire. "Thank you." She smiled. You're welcome. He hesitated for another second, then quietly added, Father says kind people are very rare. Claire's cheeks warmed slightly. Your father sounds wiser than he gives himself credit for. The little boy smiled one last time before walking toward the entrance. The men immediately surrounded him, not like guards capturing someone, but like loyal protectors escorting someone precious. As the rear door of the black sedan slowly opened, Claire instinctively looked toward the mysterious passenger inside. Before she could see his face clearly, the man lifted one gloved hand in a silent gesture. The door closed again. Moments later, the convoy disappeared into the evening traffic, leaving Claire standing beside the diner window with a strange feeling she could not explain. She never noticed that from behind the darkened glass, the pale man in the back seat had watched her until the very last second, saying only 4 quiet words to the driver. She treated him kindly. 3 days passed before Claire Dawson saw the mysterious black sedan again. Life inside Harbour Avenue Diner returned to its familiar rhythm. Morning commuters rushed in for coffee before work. Construction workers laughed over oversized breakfasts. Elderly couples shared slices of pie by the front window every afternoon. Claire threw herself into work, convincing herself that the pale little boy and the silent men in black coats belonged to a chapter of her life that had already closed. Even the white business card tucked safely inside her apron pocket began to feel less mysterious with each passing day. Yet every evening just before closing, she found herself glancing through the front window toward the street, half expecting to see a familiar small figure carrying a wooden fox. He never came. Friday arrived wrapped in thick morning fog drifting in from the harbour. Claire finished her breakfast shift just after 9 o'clock and decided to walk home instead of taking the bus. The cool air felt refreshing after hours spent inside the warm kitchen. She wandered through Riverside Park, where fallen leaves covered the winding stone paths like patches of gold and amber. Joggers passed quietly. Parents pushed strollers beneath towering oak trees. Somewhere in the distance, children laughed near a small playground. It was peaceful enough that Claire almost forgot everything that had happened during the past week. Then she noticed him. A tall man stood alone beside the edge of the lake, watching a family of ducks glide across the calm water. He wore a charcoal overcoat perfectly tailored, despite the chilly breeze, black leather gloves, and polished shoes that reflected the pale morning light. His posture was impossibly straight, almost statuesque, as though he had been standing there for hours without moving. Claire recognized him immediately, not his face, his presence. It was the same quiet silhouette she had seen through the tinted window of the black sedan. As if sensing her attention, the man slowly turned. For the first time, Claire saw him clearly. He looked no older than his early 30s. Dark hair framed sharp features that seemed carved from marble. His skin was remarkably pale, yet not unhealthy. His grey eyes held an unusual stillness, like a winter sea untouched by wind. There was nothing outwardly intimidating about him, and yet everyone who walked near him instinctively gave him space without realizing they were doing it. Claire hesitated. She could have continued walking. Instead, curiosity carried her a few steps closer. The man inclined his head politely. Miss Dawson, she blinked. You know my name, yes. His voice was calm and measured, deep enough to be memorable without ever becoming loud. May I thank you for your kindness toward the child? Claire studied him carefully. You're his father. He did not answer immediately. His gaze drifted toward the lake before returning to her. I am responsible for him. It was an odd way to phrase it. Responsible for him. Claire smiled gently anyway. He's a sweet little boy. For the first time, something almost imperceptible softened in the man's expression. Not quite a smile, more like the memory of one. He speaks highly of you. Claire laughed quietly. All I did was return a toy and give him pie. To most people, the man replied, those would have been insignificant acts. He paused briefly. To him, they were not. Claire looked toward the lake, embarrassed by the unexpected sincerity. I think any decent person would have done the same. No, his answer came without hesitation. Most would not. Silence settled comfortably between them. The wind carried ripples across the water while a flock of birds lifted into the brightening sky. After a moment, Claire asked, is he doing all right? Better than he has in some time, I'm glad. He smiles more often. Claire felt warmth spread across her face. That's wonderful. The man reached into the inside pocket of his coat and removed a small paper bag tied neatly with blue ribbon. He insisted I give you this. Claire accepted it carefully. Inside were several homemade butter cookies shaped like tiny foxes. She laughed in surprise. These are adorable. He supervised the kitchen personally. Claire looked up. Tell him thank you. I shall. She hesitated before asking the question that had lingered in her mind ever since the diner. What is his name? For the first time, the man seemed to weigh his answer. Finally he replied, Adrian. Claire repeated it softly. It's a beautiful name. The man nodded once. He was named by his mother. Another brief silence followed. Claire noticed that every passing stranger seemed to avoid interrupting them without understanding why. A cyclist steered around them. A dog suddenly stopped barking as it passed nearby. Even the breeze felt strangely still. Before she could make sense of the feeling, a black sedan rolled quietly to the curb beside the park. The same older man with silver-grey eyes stepped out and approached with measured respect. He did not even glance at Claire before addressing the stranger beside her. Sir, just one word, calm, formal, filled with unmistakable respect. The council has arrived. The tall man gave the slightest nod but did not immediately move. Instead, he looked back at Claire. Thank you again, Miss Dawson. For what? She asked. His grey eyes rested on her for one quiet moment. For reminding my son that kindness still exists. He turned and walked toward the waiting vehicle with the effortless confidence of someone who never questioned whether others would follow. The older man opened the rear door without a word. Before entering, the stranger paused briefly, looking once more across the peaceful lake where ducks continued drifting through the morning sunlight. Then he disappeared inside the sedan, which pulled silently away from the curb. Claire remained standing beside the water, holding the paper bag of fox-shaped cookies, completely unaware that the man she had just spoken with so casually was not merely Adrian's father, but the ruler before whom an entire hidden kingdom bowed its head. Claire Dawson carried the small paper bag of fox-shaped cookies all the way home without opening it. Somehow it felt wrong to eat something that had clearly been made with such careful thought by a little boy who treasured even a worn wooden toy. She placed the bag on the tiny kitchen table beside the window and smiled every time she walked past it over the next 2 days. Life slowly settled back into its ordinary rhythm, yet she could not shake the feeling that invisible threads now connected her to people she barely knew. Adrian's quiet smile lingered in her memory. So did the calm grey eyes of the mysterious man who had thanked her in the park. Late Sunday afternoon, Frank called from the kitchen just as Claire finished serving a family near the front window. Claire, can you run this catering order? The driver called in sick. She glanced toward the stack of neatly packed dessert boxes waiting by the counter. Where's it going? Frank checked the receipt. Ashmore Estate. Claire frowned. I've never heard of it. Neither have I. Apparently it's some private property outside the city. They tipped well enough to cover the trip. Claire looked at the clock. Her shift was nearly over anyway. All right, I'll take it. 20 minutes later, she was driving the diner's aging delivery van north through winding roads lined with towering maple trees. The city skyline gradually disappeared behind her, replaced by quiet hills wrapped in autumn colors. GPS reception weakened as the road narrowed into a long private lane bordered by ancient stone walls. This can't be right, Claire muttered, checking the address again. It was. At the end of the lane stood a pair of enormous wrought iron gates decorated with intricate carvings unlike anything she had ever seen. 2 silver wolves faced one another beneath an elaborate crown formed from twisting vines and crescent moons. Before Claire could press the intercom button, the gates began opening silently on their own. She froze. Okay, that's definitely expensive. The van rolled forward almost by itself as the driveway stretched through acres of perfectly maintained forest. Tall oak trees arched overhead, their branches filtering golden afternoon light across the road. There were no security guards in sight, no cameras that she could see, yet she felt unmistakably watched. After several minutes, the forest opened into a breathtaking estate overlooking a crystal-clear lake. The mansion beyond looked less like a private home and more like something lifted from another century. Dark stone walls rose 3 stories high beneath elegant towers crowned with slate roofs. Tall windows reflected the fading afternoon sun like polished mirrors. Ivy climbed across sections of the old stone without hiding its timeless beauty. Claire parked the van near the front entrance, suddenly feeling underdressed in her diner uniform. Before she could climb out, the massive front doors opened. The silver-haired gentleman from the diner descended the marble steps with measured grace. "Miss Dawson," he said with a polite inclination of his head. Claire blinked in surprise. "You work here?" One could say that. His expression remained composed. "We appreciate your delivery." Claire hurried around to unload the dessert boxes. Frank said someone ordered enough pie for 50 people. That is correct. She looked toward the quiet mansion. "Having a big party." For the first time, the older man allowed the faintest hint of amusement to reach his eyes. "Not exactly. Together they carried the boxes inside. Claire stopped almost immediately after crossing the entrance hall. The interior stole her breath. Sunlight poured through towering stained glass windows, scattering colors across polished marble floors. Massive chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings supported by carved stone columns. Portraits of unfamiliar men and women dressed in elegant black formal attire lined the walls, each painted with remarkable realism. Yet something about every portrait felt strangely similar. Calm expressions, eyes that seemed almost alive. Claire looked around in quiet amazement. This place is incredible. It has stood for many generations, the silver-haired gentleman replied simply. As they reached a grand dining hall, Claire noticed something unusual. Long banquet tables had been prepared with extraordinary precision. Crystal glasses reflected warm afternoon light. Fresh flowers filled silver vases. Dozens of chairs stood perfectly aligned. Yet there was no food except the desserts she had delivered. More strangely, none of the servants setting the tables spoke above a whisper. Every movement seemed rehearsed. Every step carried silent discipline. Claire placed the final dessert box onto the serving table. "Thank you." The older man handed her an envelope. "Your delivery payment." Claire accepted it politely but did not open it. "Please thank whoever organized this." Before the gentleman could respond, laughter echoed faintly from somewhere deeper inside the mansion. It was unmistakable Adrian. Claire instinctively turned toward the sound. A small figure appeared briefly at the end of a distant corridor, clutching the familiar wooden fox against his chest. The moment he noticed her, his face lit up with pure delight. "Claire," he called happily before starting to run. "Young master," the silver-haired gentleman exclaimed with surprising urgency. Adrian slowed immediately, glancing apologetically toward the older man before looking back at Claire. He waved enthusiastically instead. Claire smiled and waved in return. "Hi, Adrian." The little boy opened his mouth to say something else but suddenly stopped. His eyes shifted beyond Claire toward the enormous staircase overlooking the entrance hall. Every servant in the room straightened at exactly the same moment. Conversations ended instantly. The air itself seemed to grow still. Claire sensed the change before she understood it. Slow, measured footsteps echoed across polished stone. She turned instinctively. At the top of the staircase stood the same tall man she had met beside the lake. Dressed in an immaculate black suit, he rested one gloved hand lightly against the carved wooden railing as his calm grey eyes settled upon the entrance hall below. He said nothing, neither did anyone else, for reasons Claire could not explain. Every person present lowered their head ever so slightly the moment they saw him. Only Adrian continued smiling as though seeing him was the most natural thing in the world. Claire watched in puzzled silence, completely unaware that she had just stepped inside the hidden heart of an ancient kingdom. The silence that settled across the entrance hall felt almost tangible. Claire Dawson had experienced quiet restaurants before opening hours and peaceful churches on Sunday mornings, but this was different. It was the kind of silence created not by emptiness but by respect. Every servant stood perfectly still. Every conversation had vanished the instant the tall man appeared at the top of the staircase. Claire looked from the servants to Adrian, who smiled brightly as though nothing unusual had happened. The little boy hugged his wooden fox tightly before calling again, this time more softly. "Father!" The single word echoed gently through the vast hall. Claire's eyes returned to the man standing above them. He descended the marble staircase with slow, measured steps, each movement calm and effortless. His tailored black suit caught the warm afternoon light streaming through the stained glass windows, while his pale face remained composed, almost unreadable. Up close, his presence felt even more remarkable than it had in the park. Not frightening, not arrogant, simply powerful in a way that required no display. Adrian ran the last few steps toward him and stopped politely instead of throwing himself into an embrace. The man rested one gloved hand lightly on the boy's shoulder. It was a small gesture, yet unmistakably affectionate. "Did you enjoy your afternoon?" he asked. His deep voice carried easily through the hall without ever becoming loud. Adrian nodded enthusiastically. Claire came. The man's grey eyes shifted toward Claire. "I can see that." Claire smiled awkwardly, suddenly aware that she was still wearing her simple diner uniform while standing inside what looked like one of the most magnificent private estates she had ever seen. "I was delivering desserts," she explained. "I hope I wasn't interrupting anything." "Your arrival was expected." Claire blinked. "Expected?" Before he could answer, the silver-haired gentleman stepped forward and bowed his head respectfully. "My lord, the council representatives have assembled." Claire noticed the choice of words. my lord." It sounded oddly formal, almost old-fashioned. The tall man acknowledged him with a slight nod but did not immediately leave. Instead, he looked toward Adrian. "Would you excuse us for a little while?" Adrian's smile faded just enough to reveal disappointment, but he nodded obediently. "Yes, father." The boy turned toward Claire. "Will you still be here afterward?" Claire hesitated. "I should probably head back to the diner." Adrian looked down at the wooden fox in his arms before speaking very quiet. "You could stay." The words tugged unexpectedly at Claire's heart. Before she could answer, the tall man spoke again. "If Miss Dawson has no urgent obligations, I would appreciate it if she joined us for tea after the meeting." Claire stared at him in surprise. "Me? Yes, I'm just the delivery waitress. I am aware." His expression remained calm. "The invitation still stands." Claire looked toward the silver-haired gentleman who simply inclined his head as though such invitations were never questioned. "I?" She searched for a polite excuse, but none came. "All right, thank you." Adrian's face immediately brightened again. "Really?" Claire laughed softly. "Really?" The little boy hugged his wooden fox happily before following one of the servants toward another wing of the mansion. The tall man watched his son disappear down the corridor before turning back toward Claire. "He has spoken about you often these past few days." Claire smiled with quiet embarrassment. "I only gave him pie. You gave him something far more valuable than dessert." Before Claire could ask what he meant, heavy wooden doors at the far end of the hall slowly opened. Nearly a dozen elegantly dressed men and women entered together. Every one of them possessed the same unnaturally pale complexion she had noticed in the portraits lining the walls. Some looked no older than 30 despite carrying themselves with centuries of dignity. Others wore expressions so cold and reserved that Claire instinctively stepped backward. Their eyes shifted toward her almost immediately. The conversation stopped. One woman in a deep crimson gown frowned openly. Another elderly gentleman narrowed his silver eyes with unmistakable suspicion. "A human," someone murmured. "Inside the estate? Who permitted this?" whispered another voice. Claire suddenly became painfully aware that she was the only ordinary person in the room. She instinctively lowered her gaze, wishing she could disappear into the polished marble floor. The tension grew heavier with every passing second until the woman in crimson addressed the tall man directly. "Your Majesty," she said with formal precision, "the council is prepared to begin." Claire's breath caught. "Your Majesty." She looked slowly back toward the man she had met beside the lake, the man who had thanked her for returning a toy, the man who had accepted homemade cookies from his son, the man she had spoken to as though he was simply a quiet father trying his best. Every servant in the hall bowed their head at once. Every member of the council did the same. Even the silver-haired gentleman stood silently with one hand over his heart. The tall man remained composed, neither encouraging nor discouraging the display. His calm grey eyes met Claire's widened gaze across the vast entrance hall. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Then, in the same measured voice he had always used, he said, "Miss Dawson, allow me to introduce myself properly." He paused just long enough for the truth to settle over the silent room. "My name is Damien Rousseau." Another brief silence followed before he finished the sentence that changed everything. "I am the king of the vampire houses." Claire felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Every strange encounter, every mysterious black sedan, every whispered conversation, every respectful bow, every impossible coincidence suddenly aligned into one breathtaking truth. She had returned a lost toy to the son of a king, and without ever realizing it, she had earned the attention of an entire hidden kingdom. Claire Dawson could not remember how she remained standing. Her mind replayed Damien Rousseau's final sentence again and again, as if refusing to accept it. "I am the king of the vampire houses." Every unusual detail she had noticed over the past week suddenly fit together with startling clarity. The silent black vehicles, the impossibly disciplined men in dark coats, the respectful bows, Adrian's expensive clothes, the strange conversations about a young prince. None of it had been coincidence. She had unknowingly stepped into a hidden world that had existed beside her own all along. Yet what unsettled her most was not the revelation itself. It was the fact that the man standing before her looked exactly the same as he had in the park. Calm, composed, and strangely approachable despite carrying the weight of an entire kingdom, allowing her time to process the truth. He neither rushed her nor attempted to explain further. Claire finally found her voice. "Adrian is your son." Damien inclined his head once. "He is. And everyone here." Her eyes slowly moved across the silent hall filled with pale faces. They're all vampires, Damien answered simply. Claire instinctively took a slow breath. She expected panic. She expected herself to run toward the enormous front doors. Instead, she found herself remembering Adrian's delighted smile while tasting apple pie for the first time. She remembered the fox-shaped cookies. She remembered a father quietly thanking her for making his son smile again. None of those memories suddenly became frightening simply because she had learned a new word, vampire. Damien seemed to notice the conflict in her expression. "You are afraid," he observed. Claire considered the question honestly before shaking her head, confused. A faint warmth touched the corners of Damien's eyes. "That is a reasonable response." Before either of them could continue, the woman in the crimson gown stepped forward. Her elegant posture radiated authority, but the look she gave Claire was unmistakably cold. "Your Majesty," she said carefully, "the council meeting concerns matters of royal security. A human should not remain inside the Grand Hall." Several other council members nodded in agreement. "She has already seen too much," an older gentleman added. "Our laws exist for a reason." "Claire, right, I shouldn't be here." Damien turned toward the council without raising his voice. "Miss Dawson entered this estate by my invitation." "Nevertheless," the woman replied, "she knows the location of the royal residence. She has seen members of the court. She has spoken with the Crown Prince." The title caught Claire's attention immediately. Crown Prince. Adrian was not simply Damien's son. One day he would inherit everything. Damien remained silent for several moments before speaking. "She returned something that belongs to my family. That does not change the law," another council member insisted. "No," Damien answered. "It changes my judgment." The room fell silent once more. Claire looked from one face to another. Although no one openly argued with the king, the tension hanging over the hall became almost visible. These people were not angry because she had harmed anyone. They were afraid because an ordinary human had crossed a boundary that almost no outsider ever reached. The silver-haired gentleman quietly approached Damien and spoke in a respectful tone. "My lord, perhaps the archive would better explain why the child's toy cannot be viewed as an ordinary object." Damien considered the suggestion before nodding. "Very well." He turned toward Claire. "Would you walk with me?" Claire hesitated only briefly before answering. "Yes." They left the grand hall through a long corridor lined with towering windows overlooking the lake. Afternoon sunlight stretched across polished stone floors while the sounds of the council faded behind them. For several minutes neither of them spoke. The silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. Finally Claire asked the question that had lingered in her thoughts ever since the alley. Why was everyone searching so desperately for that little fox? Damien continued walking, his expression thoughtful. "Because some things cannot be replaced, even if they're only toys, especially then." They stopped before a pair of carved oak doors decorated with delicate silver vines. Damien pushed them open. Claire stepped inside and immediately realized this was unlike any library she had ever seen. Endless shelves rose toward a vaulted ceiling painted with constellations. Ancient books rested beside carefully preserved wooden boxes, handwritten journals, children's drawings, faded letters, and countless objects that seemed too ordinary to belong inside such a magnificent archive. Nothing glittered with magical power, nothing resembled treasure. Instead, the room felt to protect memories themselves. Damien walked toward a glass display resting beneath a beam of afternoon light. Inside lay another small wooden toy, a hand-carved rabbit wearing a tiny green scarf. Time had worn its paint almost completely away. Claire smiled softly. "Someone loved this one too." Damien looked at the rabbit for a long moment before answering. "My wife made them herself." Claire's smile slowly faded. "She carved them every birthday." His voice remained steady, yet something almost imperceptible changed the calm surface. "One for Adrian, one she kept here as a record of the year that had passed." Claire looked around the archive with new understanding. This room did not preserve royal wealth. It preserved family history. Damien stepped toward another display case. It stood empty. Only a neatly folded piece of dark velvet remained inside. "The fox," Claire whispered. Damien nodded once. "The toy you returned belonged there." Claire frowned. "Then why was Adrian carrying it?" Damien's eyes rested on the empty case. "Because children do not measure value the way adults do." He paused before continuing. To him it was never an artifact. Another quiet silence filled the archive. Then Damien added one final sentence. "It was the last gift his mother ever placed in his hands." Claire felt her heart tighten as she looked toward the empty display. Suddenly she understood why a frightened little boy had searched the rain-soaked streets with tears held back behind brave eyes. He had never been trying to recover a toy. He had been trying not to lose the last piece of his mother he still carried with him. Claire Dawson remained standing before the empty glass display long after Damien Rousseau finished speaking. The afternoon sunlight filtering through the tall windows illuminated tiny dust particles drifting through the air, giving the Royal Archive an almost dreamlike stillness. She looked from the vacant velvet-lined case to the shelves surrounding it, where countless ordinary objects rested behind crystal glass: a faded ribbon, a cracked porcelain cup, a child's drawing of a lakeside tree, a tiny leather shoe no bigger than her hand. None of them appeared valuable in the way museums measured value, yet every single one had been preserved with extraordinary care. "These are all memories," Claire whispered. Damien nodded. "A kingdom survives through laws and armies. A family survives through memories." Claire slowly walked past another display containing a worn bedtime storybook with frayed corners. Most people would have thrown these away years ago. Most people believe importance can be measured by gold. Damien's voice remained calm. Claire smiled faintly. "I think I would have liked her." Damien's gaze lingered on one of the display cases before he answered. "I believe she would have liked you as well." Before Claire could respond, hurried footsteps echoed from beyond the archive doors. A young guard entered, stopping several feet away before lowering one knee respectfully. "Your Majesty." Damien turned. "Report." "The council has assembled ahead of schedule." The guard hesitated for only a heartbeat. "Lady Seraphine insists the human should be questioned immediately." Claire noticed the subtle tightening of the guard's posture. Even delivering the message seemed to make him uncomfortable. Damien remained expressionless. "Tell the council they will wait." "Yes, Your Majesty." The guard bowed once more before disappearing through the doorway. Claire looked toward Damien with concern. "You are the subject of disagreement." That sounds like a polite way of saying yes. To her surprise, the faintest suggestion of amusement crossed Damien's face. It vanished almost immediately, but Claire noticed it nonetheless. "The council has protected our people for centuries," he explained as they left the archive together. "They believe caution is wisdom. And you?" Damien answered without hesitation. "I believe judgment requires evidence." They walked through another corridor overlooking the estate gardens. Outside, gardeners carefully trimmed rose bushes, while fountains shimmered beneath the late afternoon sun. Everything appeared peaceful, yet inside the mansion the atmosphere had changed. Servants moved more quietly than before. Guards stood at every intersection of the halls. No one looked directly at Claire, but she could feel curious eyes following her wherever she walked. As they approached the council chamber, raised voices drifted through the heavy wooden doors. "An unacceptable risk. She has already interacted with the Crown Prince. Humans are unpredictable." Claire instinctively slowed her steps. Damien stopped beside the entrance and looked toward her. "You may remain outside if you prefer." Claire took a slow breath before shaking her head. "No." "You are certain? If they're discussing me, I'd rather hear the truth than imagine something worse." Damien studied her quietly before opening the doors himself. The council chamber was magnificent. Sunlight poured through stained glass windows depicting ancient forests beneath silver moons. A circular marble table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by elegantly carved chairs already occupied by the kingdom's highest nobles. Every conversation ceased the instant Damien entered. Claire followed one step behind him, suddenly aware that she was the only human in a room filled with the oldest and most influential vampires in existence. Lady Seraphine rose gracefully from her chair. Her crimson gown contrasted sharply against her pale complexion, while her golden eyes remained fixed upon Claire. "Your Majesty," she began, "we appreciate your arrival." Damien took his seat at the head of the table. "Proceed." Seraphine did not sit. "Our concern remains unchanged." She gestured toward Claire. "This human has entered the royal estate, met the Crown Prince repeatedly, and now possesses knowledge that no outsider has held in generations." Another council member nodded. "The laws are explicit." Claire stood quietly near the entrance, resisting the urge to defend herself. Damien had listened to them with respect. Seraphine continued, "No one questions Miss Dawson's intentions. By all available accounts, she acted with kindness." Her tone remained composed. "Intentions, however, do not erase consequences." Several members murmured their agreement. Damien rested both hands lightly upon the polished marble table. "State your recommendation." Seraphine answered without hesitation. She should never be permitted to leave this estate. The words echoed heavily through the chamber. Claire's heart skipped. Never leave? She stared at the council members, searching for some sign that she had misunderstood. No one smiled. No one appeared dramatic. They spoke as though discussing the most reasonable solution imaginable. Damien remained silent for several long moments. The stillness inside the chamber became almost unbearable. Finally, he looked directly at Claire. His expression remained calm, yet his eyes carried unmistakable sincerity. Then he turned back toward the council. "Miss Dawson came here because I invited her." His voice remained measured, but every word carried absolute authority. "She will leave because I permit her." The chamber fell completely silent. Even Lady Seraphine seemed momentarily stunned. Damien's gaze swept slowly across every member seated around the table. "No one," he said quietly, "will treat an innocent act of kindness as a crime." Not a single voice answered him. But Claire could feel something shift inside the room. The debate had ended. The conflict had not. When the council meeting finally adjourned, the heavy doors opened one by one as the vampire nobles departed in complete silence. None of them spoke to Claire. Some acknowledged Damien with respectful bows before disappearing into the endless corridors of the estate. Others walked past her without even a glance, their unreadable expressions revealing nothing of what they truly thought. Only Lady Seraphine paused briefly near the doorway. Her golden eyes rested on Claire for a quiet moment before she inclined her head ever so slightly. It was not acceptance. It was not hostility either. It felt more like the careful acknowledgement of someone who had not yet reached a conclusion. Then she continued down the hall without another word. Claire released a slow breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. "I think that was the longest meeting I've ever attended without saying anything." Damien looked toward her. "Sometimes silence reveals more than conversation." Claire smiled faintly. "I'm still trying to decide whether that's comforting or terrifying." Something close to amusement softened Damien's features again. "Both can be true." He gestured toward a side corridor bathed in soft afternoon light. "Walk with me." Claire followed him without hesitation. They left the formal grandeur of the council wing behind and entered a quieter part of the estate, where polished marble gradually gave way to warm wooden floors and tall glass walls overlooking a winter garden. Beyond the glass, hundreds of white roses bloomed beneath the protection of an elegant conservatory, despite the cool autumn weather outside. Sunlight poured through the curved ceiling, turning every leaf into shimmering shades of emerald and silver. The atmosphere felt entirely different from the imposing halls of the palace. Here there were no guards standing at attention, no nobles whispering behind closed doors. Only birdsong drifting through partially opened windows and the gentle sound of water flowing from a marble fountain at the center of the garden. Claire slowed instinctively. "This place is beautiful." Damien looked across the flowers. "She designed it." Claire turned toward him. "Your wife?" He nodded once. "She believed winter should never erase hope." They stepped onto a narrow stone pathway winding between flowering trees. For several minutes neither of them spoke. Claire sensed that Damien had not brought her here simply to admire the garden. Eventually he stopped beside a wooden bench overlooking the fountain. "May I tell you a story?" Claire sat quietly. "I'd like that." Damien remained standing for a moment before taking the seat beside her. His posture was as composed as always, but his gaze rested somewhere beyond the glass walls, as though looking through years instead of distance. "Long before Adrian was born," he began. "My wife disliked receiving jewels." Claire looked surprised. "Really? Every anniversary I presented something more valuable than the year before." His voice remained calm. "She thanked me politely. Then she would disappear into her workshop and make toys." A faint nod. "She said children remember love more easily than diamonds." Claire smiled softly. "She sounds wise. She often proved me wrong." Damien looked toward the fountain where sunlight danced across the water. One winter she spent nearly 3 weeks carving a small wooden fox. Claire immediately thought of the toy Adrian carried everywhere. "The one I found." "Yes," Damien continued quietly. "When she finally finished it, Adrian refused to sleep unless it was beside him." Claire alarmed to understand why. As he grew older, servants offered to replace it whenever it became worn. Damien's eyes lowered briefly. He refused every time. The smile slowly disappeared from Claire's face as she remembered the frightened little boy searching the rain-soaked alley. Damien spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "Several months after his 7th birthday, his mother became ill." The garden seemed to grow even stiller. Even the birds outside fell silent. Claire did not interrupt. She knew she would not recover. Damien's expression remained composed, but each carefully chosen word carried the weight of memories long protected behind silence. On her final morning, she asked Adrian to promise something. Claire waited. She told him, Damien paused briefly, that whenever he felt lonely, he should hold the little fox close and remember that love does not disappear simply because someone is no longer seen. Claire felt her throat tighten. She pictured Adrian hugging the worn wooden toy beneath the rain while desperately searching the empty streets. Suddenly, every scratch on its wooden surface became precious. Every faded patch of paint became another year of a little boy refusing to let go of the last gift his mother had ever placed into his hands. "I'm sorry," Claire whispered. Damien remained silent for several moments. Finally, he looked toward her instead of the fountain. "Most people who hear that story apologize for my loss." Claire frowned gently. "Shouldn't they? You apologized for Adrian's." She blinked, surprised she had done so without realizing it. Damien's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "That is why he trusted you before he even knew your name." A cool breeze drifted through the conservatory, carrying the delicate fragrance of white roses between them. Claire lowered her eyes toward her hands, thinking about the frightened little boy, the worn wooden fox, and the father who had carried centuries of authority without ever learning how to replace one irreplaceable absence. For the first time since entering the hidden world of vampires, she no longer saw Damien Rousseau as simply a king. She saw a widowed father still trying every single day to keep one promise made to the woman he had loved most. Morning sunlight poured through the towering glass ceiling of the winter conservatory, bathing the white roses in a warm golden glow. Claire Dawson remained seated beside Damien Rousseau, letting the quiet settle naturally between them. After hearing about Adrian's mother, the entire estate felt different. The magnificent halls no longer seemed cold or mysterious. They felt like a home that had learned to live with grief. Somewhere beyond the glass walls, birds sang softly as gardeners trimmed flowering vines with careful hands. It was difficult to imagine that only an hour earlier she had stood inside a council chamber where her fate had been debated by some of the oldest vampires in existence. Damien rose from the bench and glanced toward the garden path winding around the fountain. "Would you like to see where Adrian spends most of his mornings?" "I'd love to." They walked through the conservatory until they reached a smaller courtyard hidden behind climbing ivy. Unlike the formal gardens near the front of the estate, this place felt wonderfully ordinary. A swing hung beneath a broad oak tree. Flower beds surrounded a narrow stone path. Wooden toys rested neatly on a blanket spread across the grass. Adrian sat cross-legged beneath the tree, completely absorbed in building a tiny castle from carved wooden blocks. The little fox rested beside him as always. The moment he looked up and saw Claire, his entire face brightened. "Claire!" He jumped to his feet and ran toward her. Claire laughed as someone is having a better day. Adrian nodded happily. "Father said you stayed." "I did." "Good." He took her hand without hesitation and gently pulled her toward the blanket. "Help me build the bridge." Claire looked toward Damien with a questioning smile. The king simply gave a small nod before remaining several steps away, allowing them their moment. Claire sat beside Adrian and examined the tiny wooden blocks. "You've already built half the castle," Adrian grinned proudly. "But every castle needs a bridge." "You're absolutely right." Together they carefully placed the remaining pieces across a small gap between two towers. Adrian concentrated so intensely that the tip of his tongue peeked from the corner of his mouth. Claire smiled to herself. Children truly were the same everywhere, whether they belonged to ordinary families or hidden kingdoms. After several minutes, Adrian suddenly stopped building. He picked up the little wooden fox and looked at it thoughtfully. "Mother always made the bridge last," he said quietly. Claire looked toward him. "Did she?" He nodded. "She said bridges help lonely people find each other." Claire felt warmth spread gently through her chest. Before she could answer, hurried footsteps approached across the stone path. The silver-haired gentleman appeared, his usually calm expression touched by unusual urgency. He bowed respectfully toward Damien. "Your Majesty." Damien stepped forward. "What has happened?" "The royal treasury has reported an incident." Claire noticed the older man's careful choice of words, but his voice carried unmistakable concern. Damien's expression became serious. "Explain." "The inner archive was inspected during the council session." He paused. "One protected item is no longer where it should be." Adrian looked up from the blanket, confused. Damien's grey eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. "Which item?" The silver-haired gentleman answered without hesitation. "The royal blood crest." Silence fell across the courtyard. Claire looked from one face to another. She had heard those words only once before inside the archive, when Damien explained that something hidden within Adrian's wooden fox carried importance beyond memory alone. Damien remained completely still. Has the estate been sealed? Immediately. Has anyone left the grounds? No, Your Majesty. Adrian slowly stood, clutching the little fox against his chest. Father. Damien turned toward his son, and the calm authority in his expression softened instantly. Everything is all right. Adrian looked uncertain. Is someone in trouble? Damien knelt until they were eye level. Not yet. The little boy lowered his gaze to the wooden fox in his hands. Did I do something wrong? Claire immediately reached over and gently rested one hand on his shoulder. No, Adrian. He looked up at her. Sometimes grown-ups have problems that children didn't create. Adrian searched her face for a moment before giving a tiny nod. Damien rose slowly. His attention shifted toward the silver-haired gentleman once more. No one outside this estate is to know the crest is missing. Understood. Continue the search quietly. At once. The older man departed almost immediately, disappearing through the ivy-covered archway. Claire watched him go before turning toward Damien. The royal blood crest, she began carefully. Is that the symbol you mentioned inside the archive? Damien nodded once. Yes. Can someone use it to hurt Adrian? Damien did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the peaceful courtyard where his son had returned to quietly arranging the wooden blocks of his unfinished bridge. Finally he spoke. In the wrong hands, it could threaten far more than my family. Claire looked at the little boy building his tiny castle beneath the oak tree, completely unaware that somewhere within the estate an object tied to his future had disappeared. The warm afternoon suddenly felt colder than before. Whatever peace had begun to grow inside the hidden kingdom had just been interrupted by a danger no one had expected. The atmosphere inside Ashmore Estate changed before sunset. Claire Dawson noticed it the moment she stepped back into the main corridor. Servants who had once moved with calm confidence now walked with quiet urgency. Guards appeared at every hallway intersection, their sharp eyes observing every doorway without alarming the household. No one ran, no one shouted. The entire estate responded with disciplined precision, as though it had rehearsed for moments like this countless times before. Adrian sensed the difference as well. While they walked back from the courtyard, he held the little wooden fox more tightly than usual. Every few steps he glanced toward Damien, searching his father's face for reassurance. Damien remained composed, but Claire had begun to recognize the subtle signs that revealed his concern. His silence had become even quieter. His gaze lingered longer on passing guards. Every decision he made seemed carefully measured. They entered a private sitting room overlooking the lake just as the first colors of sunset reflected across the water. A fire crackled softly inside the stone fireplace, filling the room with gentle warmth. Adrian climbed into a large armchair near the window and continued arranging his wooden blocks, trying his best to pretend nothing had changed. Claire watched him for a moment before turning toward Damien. He's trying not to worry. Damien nodded. He has learned to read the moods of everyone around him. Claire looked back at the child. Children always do. A brief silence followed before Damien spoke again. That is one reason I try never to let him see fear. Claire understood immediately, because then he'd carry it too. Damien's eyes met hers. Exactly. Before either of them could continue, the silver-haired gentleman entered quietly and closed the door behind him. Your Majesty, Damien turned. Report. Every chamber of the royal treasury has been searched twice, and the royal blood crest has not been recovered. Claire felt the room grow heavier. Damien remained perfectly still. Evidence of forced entry? No. Signs of violence? No. Then the item did not leave. Inclined his head. That is also my conclusion. Claire listened carefully. Someone took it willingly. Both men looked toward her. Damien answered first, or someone had lawful access. The implication settled heavily over the room. Whoever had removed the royal blood crest was not an outsider climbing over castle walls in the middle of the night. It was someone who belonged inside the estate. Adrian looked up from his blocks. What's a crest? Claire hesitated, unsure how to answer. Damien crossed the room and knelt beside his son. It is something our family protects. Adrian considered that quietly before asking another question. Can we find it? Damien rested a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. We will. Adrian nodded with complete trust. I know you will. Claire watched the exchange silently. There was no false promise in Damien's voice, only quiet determination. The little boy accepted that without question because in his world, his father had always found a way to make things right. The silver-haired gentleman cleared his throat gently. Your Majesty, there is another matter. Damien rose. Speak. Several members of the council have requested an emergency session at dawn. Claire looked toward him. Because of the missing crest. Officially, the older gentleman hesitated. Unofficially, many believe Miss Dawson's arrival and the disappearance are connected. Claire felt her stomach tighten. They think I stole it? Some believe coincidence has become difficult to ignore. Damien answered before the older man could continue. Coincidence is not evidence. No, Your Majesty, nor will it become evidence merely because repeated often enough. The silver-haired gentleman lowered his head respectfully. I understand. After he departed, the room became quiet once again. Claire stared into the fire for several long moments before speaking. Maybe they're right to question me. Damien looked at her calmly. Do you know where the crest is? No. Did you remove it? Of course not. Then there is nothing further to discuss. Claire sighed softly. It's not that simple. It is to me. His answer came without hesitation. I judge actions, not assumptions. Those words settled deeply within her. For the first time since arriving at the estate, Claire realized Damien had never once treated her as an outsider who needed to prove her worth. He had watched her return a toy to a frightened child with no expectation of reward. Everything that followed had been measured against that single act of kindness. Outside, the final light of day faded beyond the lake as evening shadows stretched across the gardens. Adrian quietly finished building his wooden bridge and carefully placed the little fox at its center. He smiled to himself. Now nobody has to cross alone. Claire looked at the tiny bridge and felt an unexpected ache in her chest. She had unknowingly become one herself, a bridge between two worlds that had spent centuries separated by fear and secrecy. Whether that bridge would endure or collapse beneath the weight of suspicion would be decided when the council gathered again at sunrise. Somewhere else within the vast estate, hidden from every searching eye, a gloved hand carefully placed the missing royal blood crest inside a small velvet box before extinguishing the candle beside it. The thief remained unseen. But the next morning's council meeting would bring the hidden kingdom one step closer to the truth. Dawn arrived beneath a sky washed in pale silver, casting long beams of morning light through the stained glass windows of the Grand Council chamber. Claire Dawson stood quietly near the entrance, her hands folded before her, while rows of ancient vampire nobles gathered around the circular marble table. The atmosphere felt different from the previous meeting. No raised voices echoed through the chamber. No hurried whispers filled the silence. Every face carried the same solemn expression, as though each member understood that whatever happened this morning would shape the future of the kingdom far beyond the disappearance of a single object. Damien Rousseau entered last. As always, every person in the chamber rose to their feet. Respect spread through the room without a single command. Damien acknowledged the gathering with a slight inclination of his head before taking his place at the head of the table. Adrian was not present. Claire silently hoped that someone had kept him away from the uncertainty unfolding here. The silver-haired steward stepped forward, carrying a dark wooden case sealed with the royal crest. He placed it carefully upon the marble table. "Your Majesty," he announced. Every eye turned toward the box. Claire felt her heartbeat quicken. Damien remained perfectly composed. "Present your findings." The steward opened the case. Resting inside, upon a square of deep blue velvet, lay the royal blood crest. Its silver surface caught the morning light, revealing delicate engravings that resembled intertwining branches surrounding an ancient crown. It was smaller than Claire had imagined, elegant, unassuming. It looked less like a symbol of power than something created to be quietly treasured. A murmur spread through the chamber before fading almost immediately. Damien's gaze settled upon the crest. Where was it found? The steward answered without hesitation. Inside the private chamber of Councillor Lucien Armand, silence descended once again. Several council members turned sharply toward an elderly vampire seated halfway down the table. Lucien did not flee. He did not protest. Instead, he slowly rose from his chair with remarkable dignity. His silver eyes met Damien's without fear. "It is true," he said calmly. Claire stared in disbelief. The thief had been sitting among them all along. Lady Seraphine's voice broke the silence. "Why?" Lucien looked around the chamber before answering. "Because I believed fear had begun to weaken our judgment." No one interrupted him. "For centuries we protected our existence by trusting no human. Then one ordinary waitress entered our most sacred halls, and within days His Majesty defended her before the council." He turned briefly toward Claire. "I wish to know whether compassion had clouded wisdom." Claire frowned. "So, you stole it to make everyone suspect me?" Lucien lowered his eyes. "Yes." The honesty of his answer somehow made it even more painful. Damien remained silent until the room settled once more. Finally he spoke. Did Miss Dawson ever possess the crest? No. Did she ever seek it? No. Did she know where it was kept? She answered quietly. No, Your Majesty. Damien looked slowly around the council table. Then the matter before us is no longer the disappearance of the crest. No one disagreed. His calm voice carried effortlessly through the chamber. It is whether fear should outweigh truth. Claire watched the faces surrounding the table. One by one, expressions of certainty began giving way to reflection. Lady Seraphine was the first to rise. She turned toward Claire and lowered her head respectfully. Miss Dawson, I owe you an apology. Claire blinked in surprise. You believed I endangered this kingdom, yet your actions have done nothing except protect its future. Several other council members followed her example, standing one after another in silent acknowledgement. The gesture was simple, yet its meaning filled the chamber more powerfully than any speech could have. Damien finally rose from his chair. He walked toward Claire until only a few steps separated them. Every eye followed him. When Adrian lost the wooden fox, he said quietly, You did not ask who he was. Claire met his gaze. He was just a little boy. Damien nodded. When strangers questioned you, you did not ask what reward you might receive. Claire smiled faintly. To be one. When suspicion fell upon you, you did not answer with anger. The chamber remained completely silent. Damien looked toward the council before speaking one final time. This kingdom has spent generations hiding from humanity because we feared being judged before being known. His eyes returned to Claire. Today we nearly repeated that same injustice ourselves. Lady Seraphine slowly stepped forward carrying the restored royal blood crest. Instead of presenting it to Damien, she placed it gently into Claire's open hands. Claire looked down in surprise. I don't understand. Seraphine smiled for the first time. It was small, but genuine. Return it. Claire carefully turned toward Damien. Without ceremony, without fear, she offered the crest back to its rightful guardian using both hands, exactly as she had once returned a weathered wooden fox to a lonely child in a rain-soaked alley. Damien accepted it with quiet gratitude. For a brief moment, neither king nor waitress spoke. They did not need to. Everyone in the chamber understood the truth that no law, no title, and no ancient tradition could erase. The smallest act of kindness had become the bridge that finally allowed two worlds to see one another without fear. The first light of morning spilled gently across the eastern sky, washing Ashmore Estate in shades of gold that softened even its oldest stone walls. For the first time since Claire Dawson had crossed the estate gates, the air felt completely different. The quiet no longer carried suspicion, it carried peace. Servants moved through the gardens with relaxed smiles instead of guarded expressions. Guards stood at their usual posts, but their watchful eyes no longer followed Claire as she walked beneath rows of flowering trees. The weight that had rested over the hidden kingdom for days had finally lifted. Somewhere nearby, cheerful laughter echoed across the gardens. Claire followed the sound until she reached the wide lawn overlooking the lake. Adrian was running through the dew-covered grass with the little wooden fox tucked beneath one arm. Every few steps he stopped to invent another adventure for his faithful companion before racing toward the old oak tree at the center of the garden. Claire, he called the moment he saw her. She laughed and waved back. Looks like someone has endless energy this morning. Adrian grinned. Father said I can play outside as long as I want today. That sounds like an excellent plan. He hurried over and proudly held up the little fox. He's happy now. Claire gently touched one of the toy's worn wooden ears. The scratches were still there. The faded blue scarf had not been repainted. Nothing about the little fox had been restored except the peace surrounding it, somehow that made it even more beautiful. I think he always was, she said softly. Adrian smiled before running back toward the oak tree, where he immediately began building another tiny wooden bridge across the roots. Claire watched him for several quiet moments until slow footsteps approached from behind. She did not need to turn around to know who it was. Damien Rousseau stopped beside her, his hands resting comfortably behind his back as he looked toward his son playing beneath the morning sun. Neither of them spoke immediately. Sometimes silence was enough. Finally, Damien broke it. He slept through the night. Claire looked toward him. Without waking, Damien nodded once. For the first time since his mother passed away, Claire felt a quiet warmth spread through her chest. I'm glad. Damien's gaze remained on Adrian. So am I. A gentle breeze, the fragrance of white roses across the garden. Somewhere beyond the hedges, birds greeted the new day while sunlight shimmered across the calm surface of the lake. Claire smiled. Your wife would have loved this morning. Damien remained silent for a long moment, then almost imperceptibly he nodded. She would have. He reached into the pocket of his coat and removed a small velvet pouch. "There is something I wish to return." Claire looked puzzled. Damien opened the pouch and revealed the white business card the silver-haired steward had given her at the diner. "We no longer require this." Claire laughed softly as she accepted it. "I was wondering if I should keep it." "You may." She turned the card over curiously. The blank back now carried a single handwritten sentence in elegant silver ink. "You will always be welcome here." Claire looked up in surprise. Damien's expression remained calm, but his grey eyes held a quiet sincerity that required no further explanation. Before she could respond, Adrian came running back across the grass. "Father, Claire, come see." They followed him beneath the old oak tree. There, stretching carefully between two exposed roots, stood a tiny wooden bridge built from the same carved blocks Claire had helped him assemble days earlier. Adrian carefully placed the little fox at one end before looking proudly at both of them. Now he never has to cross alone. Claire felt tears threaten the corners of her eyes. Damien looked down at the bridge, then at his son, and finally toward Claire. "Neither do we," he said quietly. It was not a declaration made before a council or a kingdom. It was something smaller, something infinitely more important, a promise. Lady Seraphine and several members of the council watched from a distant terrace. None of them interrupted. The silver-haired steward stood beside them with a peaceful smile, knowing that no royal decree could have accomplished what one simple act of kindness had achieved. Claire looked across the garden, where ancient vampires and ordinary human memories now shared the same morning sunlight without fear. She realized she no longer felt like a visitor walking through someone else's world. She simply felt welcome. Adrian laughed as he chased the little wooden fox across the grass, his carefree footsteps echoing through the estate that had once seemed impossibly distant. Damien stood quietly beside Claire, saying nothing as the sun climbed higher into a cloudless sky. The same kindness that had led a tired waitress to pick up a forgotten toy in a rain-soaked alley had become the beginning of a new chapter for an ancient family. The kingdom had protected its traditions for centuries. Claire had protected something far more fragile without ever realizing it. She had protected hope, and beneath the warm light of a new morning, as a little boy played happily with the last gift his mother had ever given him, the hidden kingdom discovered that its greatest treasure had never been a royal crest, an ancient title, or a throne of stone. It had always been the quiet courage to trust kindness when fear seemed easier.